let's talk about fascism. Shall we? Fascism is admittedly a complicated subject. I mean, we all know about it as a concept. It's a word we all know, at least. But it can be a bit difficult to define. There are many definitions, with the most famous, and the one you're most likely to know, being Umberto Eco's 14 Tenets of Fascism from his essay, Fascism. But to save us some time, I'm going to use a much more succinct definition from Robert O. Paxton that I also think captures a similar spirit.
Fascism may be defined as a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants, working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites, abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints goals of internal cleansing and external expansion.
That being said, growing up in America, I didn't always think of fascism as that definition. I'm sure a lot of people didn't. Because there's kind of one group that overshadows everything when you bring up fascism. One goose-stepping group of brown shirts that have lived on in infamy since the last World War. Nazis. The most evil of evil, the scum of the earth, so beyond the pale of good taste that their name has become synonymous with the concept of pure destruction and maddening violence. And despite that all being true, the infamy kinda can cloud fascism's definition in a way. I mean, they're Nazis. We've all been taught since birth about the evil that they did, with the hindsight of it all presented to us nearly every day. And as a result, it can be hard to not look at that as a high standard of evil that all under the fascism umbrella must meet. After all, if you're referring to something as fascist, you're putting it in the same category as the most evil thing we all know is evil. And that can make it easy for people to miss the warning signs of fascism as they creep in. After all, they all won't look exactly like the Nazis of the past. A lot of them know how that's bad optics. We need to be able to see beyond hindsight, to see what fascism looks like beyond the red, white, and black. So let's take a look at the less discussed evil of the Axis powers. The one that popularized the term fascism itself. One that you probably know less about compared to its infamous ally. Let's talk about Italy and Benito Mussolini. Post-World War I, Italy was left in shambles. Just like Germany, the Treaty of Versailles had left the country weakened and politically confused. Using the ideology of a strong national identity, his siding against socialists that gained the support of industrialists, and his violent militia known as the Black Shirts, Benito Mussolini slowly built up a base of supporters large enough where he didn't even need an election. Instead, his militia took part in the infamous March on Rome on October 25, 1922, where they surrounded the capital and attempted to intimidate the Prime Minister into giving his post to Mussolini. Yes, that sentence does sound incredibly familiar, I know. The Prime Minister wished to respond with martial law, and a battle the fascists would have almost assuredly lost, but the King of Italy found himself impressed by Mussolini and refused to sign off on the Prime Minister's order, which then led to the Prime Minister and his cabinet resigning. Mussolini was now in charge, and would gain absolute power. He wished to root out any that opposed him and regain the image of a strong national might, leading to expansion, tight-fisted militaristic leadership, and death squads dedicated to groups labeled enemies of the state like socialist Slavs and Africans. Of course, as we all know, that did not end well. The Nazi dream of an empire fell in the cold winters of Russia, and their leader's own gun blast to the head. In 1943, Mussolini would be removed from power, imprisoned, and then eventually escape from prison, leading Italy as a puppet state from Nazi Germany for a few years before Hitler died, before eventually being intercepted by partisan communists and shot. His body would then be dumped into the central square of Milan, where the Italian public he had thought he was spreading glory to would end up desecrating his body and cheering on the death of their former dictator. His final resting place would be an unmarked grave, with the shadow of his reign haunting Italy to this very day. Instead, the national pride that was supposed to be brought by the dictatorship of Mussolini came in a different form, in the proud tradition of Italian rebellion. From the partisans who fought back against the black shirts and the Nazis, to the anti-fascist protest songs that are sung in Italy to this very day. And out of this cultural rebellion came one of Italy's most famous exports: its films. Italian film existed prior to this point, but isn't until Italian neorealism that Italian cinema truly found its identity. The movement was founded by communist filmmakers of the 40s, seeking to bring honesty back to the propaganda-soaked film of the time. Anti-fascist to its core and featuring everyday people as actors, the movement was helmed by legendary filmmakers like Vittorio De Sica, Luciano Visconti, and Roberto Rossellini. It's hard to find an Italian filmmaker from the following eras that was not an avowed leftist or anti-fascist of some kind, nor a filmmaker who didn't attempt to touch on the scars of fascism through their films. From Fellini's childhood epic Amarcord critiquing the fascist government he grew up under, to Luciano Visconti's The Damned, which tells a sordid tale in Nazi Germany. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the infamous and ever controversial brutality of Piero Paolo Pasolini's Salò, or the 120 Days of Sodom, a film that was so horrifying that it was banned in several countries and is, to this day, considered maybe the most disturbing film ever made. But maybe none tackled the subject as prolifically as Italian filmmaking icon Bernardo Bertolucci. Now, Bernardo Bertolucci has a reputation surrounding him, mostly related to his prowess at filmmaking and his legacy as an Italian icon that made dozens of classic films. But in recent years, his reputation has soured due to his conduct during the shooting of one of his films that came to light in the past few decades and left his legacy with a huge stain. That being him and Marlon Brando's attempt to humiliate actress Maria Schneider with a simulated rape scene that she said was not in the script and has stated she had no prior knowledge of. To be clear, the scene was simulated, but regardless, the attempt was still to humiliate her, and she still stated that she was utterly humiliated and felt absolutely pressured into it. For his part, Bertolucci did not deny that it happened, but instead say that the scene was indeed in the script, but the note of butter being used as lubricant was not. Regardless of that insistence, the damage is still very clear, as Maria Schneider died in 2011, having maintained that that scene had violated her and stunted her ability to act, as seen by the fact that her promising career had very few film roles after that. Bertolucci himself passed away in 2018. That moment does leave quite a black mark on his legacy, and it disgusts me to my core. And as such, it felt necessary to bring up before moving forward with my analysis of his filmmaking and the praise I'm about to heap on a lot of it. It's something that no director or actor should under any circumstances be allowed to commit and not have it permanently stain their legacy and have it come up in every discussion about their works. However, after this warning, we are going to be dealing with his works unrelated to that film on their own and unrelated to the controversy. It is something that I knew had to be mentioned for any responsible analysis of his career, and I would not be able to forgive myself if I didn't let you all know that this had happened. But it's not completely relevant to our analysis of this film or his other anti-fascist works. So I'm just going to keep this here as a warning about his legacy and his career, as I think it's important to mention. But going on from this point, it's not going to be mentioned in the rest of the video. With that having been said, let's explore the career of Bernardo Bertolucci. Born in March 1941, Italian filmmaker Bernardo Bertolucci had, inarguably, one of the most prolific careers in Italian filmmaking. With his uncompromising style and political intrigue stemming from his open Marxism, he took storm of the industry. From his earlier Before the Revolution, to his 5-hour-long epic on Italian social class that is 1900, to his Best Picture-winning The Last Emperor, which managed to conquer America's most hallowed film award despite its anti-political elite and pro-communist themes, to even the late career renaissance in The Dreamers. Bertolucci aimed his flag into Italian film culture's center and remains one of the most important figures of the scene, only matched by Fellini and Leone in fame. But if there was one topic that Bertolucci covered more finely than anyone else of that scene, it was fascism. In the 1970s alone, he made 3 different films touching on Italy's ugly past with fascism. Spider's Stratagem contains a political mystery of the scars of fascist Italy and how many choose to remember the past incorrectly, but if that's what's needed to keep fascism at bay, that may be important. And the 5 hours of 1900 end up chronicling a class divide that ends up leading to the conflict between fascists and industrialists with the partisan socialists who work for them. But there is no Bertolucci film that can compare to the anti-fascist legacy of The Conformist. Maybe the director's most iconic film, The Conformist came out in 1971 and has gone on to lead one of the most illustrious legacies in all of film history. Not only one of the most beautifully shot films ever made with the stunning cinematography of Vittorio Storaro, who many of you may know for his work with Francis Ford Coppola and Warren Beatty, but especially in its text, as it's one of the most fascinating dives into fascism I've ever seen in film. The film chronicles Marcello Clerici, an Italian man who wishes nothing more than to blend in, to be normal, to conform. The film begins with and is interspersed with Marcello in a car with a member of the Italian secret police as they travel to an unknown destination after an unknown man and wife. Through a series of flashbacks, we see him as he prepares to marry his wife and celebrates said engagement with his blind best friend Italo Montanari, who he has a tender relationship with.
Ma che ti aspetti dal matrimonio?
Vedi, l'impressione della normalità.
La normalità.
Sì, la stabilità, la sicurezza. La mattina mentre mi vesto, mi guardo nello specchio e mi sembra che la mia immagine sia diversa da quella di tutti gli altri.
Così tu ti sposi, io perdo il mio migliore amico, ma sono contento.
We see him visiting his parents, his mother a drug addict living in a crumbling villa with her Japanese lover and driver, and his father who has been driven mad by syphilis and the guilt he feels over his past violent actions in the name of the state. And finally, we see him recruited by the Italian secret police for his job. He and his wife must visit his former professor Quattri in Paris, a dissident who has fled Italy and helps to lead a protest movement from Paris. From there, we see him and his wife visiting Quattri as Marcello struggles between his commitment to normality and acceptance in a fascist society and the resulting betrayal of Professor Quattri and his wife, whom he soon falls in love with. Quattri disagrees with Marcello's fascist beliefs, but insists that he still sees the same bright student he used to teach, and finds their reconvening special. Despite this, Marcello eventually goes through with planning the attack, with him begging Quattri's wife to stay home, as Quattri is brutally assassinated by the Italian secret police, as is his wife, whom Marcello refuses to shoot or stand up for due to his cowardice.
Vigliacchi, invertiti, ebrei, sono tutti una razza. Forse per me li metterei al muro tutti insieme.
We cut 5 years later. Marcello and his wife have had their conventional life, a nice house with a daughter all their own, despite a seemingly growing divide between them, as the radio announces that Mussolini has resigned as prime minister, immediately signaling his imprisonment. The fascist party that Marcello has worked so hard to gain acceptance to submit his normality to society that he killed for, is now gone. Marcello reunites on the streets that night with Italo as they watch as the dictatorship falls. As we reach the finale, there is one important detail I forgot to mention here, and that is Marcello's sexuality. See, at several points in the film, we see Marcello pine for normalcy. He openly notes to a priest that he doesn't even see much in his wife, but that he desperately craves the look a marriage and a family will give himself. And yet, in the same scene he is admitting his sins, we get a flashback to his childhood. In the sequence, we see a young Marcello bullied by his peers in front of a group of adults who simply watch and don't interfere, only for a limo driver to swing by hoping to cheer up Marcello. His name is Lino. As Marcello and Lino drive off to the manor of Lino's employers, Lino sexually advances onto Marcello, and Marcello reciprocates. That's kind of the interesting thing about this scene. It is clearly child abuse, and I'm not going to deny that. It's definitely coercive. But in this moment, as Marcello speaks to the priest, it's almost as if this meaning means something else to him. That maybe Marcello realized something about himself in that moment. Something he fears. Something that would make him impossible to conform. After all, it's notable that Marcello refers to the event not as an abuse of himself, but as something he must make up for and be forgiven for by society. Marcello doesn't refer to it as an act of child abuse, but instead, an act of homosexuality.
E dopo quella volta hai avuto altri rapporti con uomini?
No, vita sessuale normale.
Vale a dire?
Il bordello verso i 18 anni. E poi soltanto rapporti con donne. La normalità. Voglio costruire la mia normalità. Faticosamente.
Ma nella religione?
Fuori dalla religione. Dio è così buono. La Vergine è così materna. Cristo è così misericordioso. E il prete è pieno di comprensione.
Devi pentirti, figliuolo, devi implorare il perdono.
Mi sono già pentito. Voglio che il perdono me lo dia la società. Sì. Mi confesso oggi per la colpa che commetterò domani. È il sangue che lava il sangue. Il prezzo che mi chiede la società. Io lo pagherò.
Realizing what he's done, Marcello grabs Lino's gun, firing wildly, and presumes that he has killed Lino, as Lino passes out on the floor bleeding from his face. And this is where we return to the finale. See, as Marcello and Italo walk through the streets, Marcello stops and notices a familiar voice.
Lino! Vi chiamate Lino voi? Io? Sì, perché? Non facevate l'autista? No? Sì, ma tant'anni fa. Già.
Marcello starts berating Lino for their prior interaction, but as he continues yelling, he slowly starts blaming Lino for the murder of Quattri as well, seemingly twisting his blame for what he's done all on Lino, as if seeing Lino as the parts of himself that he hates.
Che facevi il 25 marzo 1917? Io? Ma voi chi siete? Siete pazzi? Cosa facevi il 25 marzo 1917? Ma lasciatemi stare!
E il 15 ottobre 1938, dov'eri? Che facevi?
Assassino! Assassino! Ha assassinato un uomo! Un esiliato politico! Il 15 ottobre 1938! È un pederasta! Fascista!
As Italo objects, Marcello turns around screaming that Italo himself is also a devout fascist.
Marcello, te ne prego, sta zitto. Marcello, dove sei?
Fascista!
No, Marcello.
Anche lui
Che
è
cosa
fascista.
fai? Marcello.
Questo qui.
Before leaving his blind friend to wander into a crowd of partisans, as he cries out for Marcello. Marcello realizes that he has no place with the anti-fascists, nor can exist as a fascist anymore, and can only sit and turn to the camera to face the flame. End of film. The downfall of Marcello remains his desire for conformity. That desire wipes away his joy, his chances at happiness, and his humanity as he allows a trusted friend to die at the hands of the secret police. And meanwhile, throughout the entire film, we're presented with this relationship he has with Italo. One of understanding and joy. It's seemingly the only time in the film where we see him genuinely smile. We see their kinship, the seeming love Italo has for him, and yet, that desire to conform is always there. In one scene where Italo has his entire support group for blind citizens celebrate Marcello's engagement, we see them share a quiet moment together, and Italo remarks how different Marcello is from everyone else. Different in a way like him, and that's why he's so bound to him.
Ti sei mai chiesto com'è che siamo amici? Perché noi due siamo diversi dagli altri. Siamo animali della stessa razza.
And in that moment, after so much time together laughing, Marcello hesitates. The rest of the conversation, he looks uncomfortable, and it ends with him noticing that Italo has different color loafers on. As we know, Italo is blind, and that blindness makes him different. And Marcello cannot be different. And with the next scene, Marcello takes the order to kill Professor Quattri. It's obviously not stated directly that Marcello is queer and has romantic feelings for Italo, and many would disagree with me on my reading of that, but I do think it's heavily implied, and I'm not the only person to come to that conclusion. I mean, as stated, he believes his biggest sin in his mind was having sex with a man, and again, he even states directly that he doesn't even love his wife.
Sto per costruirmi una vita normale. Sposo una piccola borghese.
Allora deve essere una brava ragazza.
Mediocre. Piena di idee meschine.
And in his biggest crisis of conscience, he leaves behind his only friend when faced with the very man with which he committed that act he wants to make up for. It's with that fear of resembling anything that isn't normal that he becomes so dedicated to conformity that he shuns anything resembling non-normality. It's the very essence of his ideology, and it contributes to the thesis of the film. The fascist desire to conform in order to be loved eradicates everything around it. And yet, with every point he turns with Quattri, there is an opportunity that comes to him, something that tantalizes him to maybe accept himself beyond society's conformities. When Marcello visits fascists in Italy, he finds them existing in cold and large brutalist spaces, often real fascist locations, with Italy existing in a color palette that's drab and only regains color once Mussolini falls. This contrasts with the sprawling, colorful, and lively places throughout Paris that Quattri brings Marcello and his wife to. Quattri constantly welcomes Marcello and entrusts him. He even tests Marcello by giving him a letter to deliver to his comrades fighting the fascists, which Marcello, in a fit of anxiety over such responsibility, gives back to Quattri, saying he could not be trusted. Quattri later reveals that the letter was blank all along and that it was to prove that Marcello is more than the devout arm of the state that he thinks he is. And Quattri's wife, Anna, whom Marcello becomes enamored with, is maybe the closest he gets to leaving behind his fascist mind state. Anna is sexually liberated. She is openly bisexual, flirting with Marcello and his wife constantly, with her representing a freedom from the drab life of conformity and fascistic flame.
Ti prego, non guardarmi. Mi vergogno.
Che c'è di male? Sono una donna come te.
Sì, ma mi guardi in un modo.
And while Marcello's wife seemingly remains ignorant of the total depth of Anna's feelings, she more than Marcello gives in and enjoys herself, finding Paris much more fruitful and fun. At dinner, Anna plays sexually with Marcello's leg under the table right before Marcello receives said blank letter from Quattri. The conflict causes him to leap up and leave for a place in the restaurant to talk with his fellow secret police member, who convinces him that he cannot be a coward.
Dottore, camerata, guardiamoci bene negli occhi. Questa è una guerra. E chi molle è un disertore.
They travel to a dance hall afterwards as Marcello watches as Anna and his wife have an incredibly sexually charged dance, free in their sexualities.
Ma le faccia smettere. Perché? Sono così belli.
Because that is what fascism despises more than anything. A world of acceptance. Because they've spent so long wishing to be perceived as normal by the very people that shun them. They wish to avoid ostracization and force the rest of the world to conform or die with them. It treats tradition as its Bible, and it becomes mandatory to enforce it just as it was once enforced onto them. They wish to avoid ostracization and force the rest of the world to conform or die with them. It treats tradition as its Bible, and it becomes mandatory to enforce it just as it was once enforced onto them. To quote Wilhelm Reich,
"The complete register of cultural values, which fits into the fabric of reactionary ideology as parts into a machine, is immediately appended. Marriage as a tie, family as a duty, fatherland as a value in itself, morality as authority, religion as an obligation deriving from eternity. The rigidity of the human plasma could not be more accurately described."
The box of normality is the dream of the outcast who does not wish to accept themselves, but desires to hate themselves. The one who wishes to be loved and thus follows orders and acts in order to maintain an acceptance by others. And while Marcello may be a complex human at heart, there is no part of him he won't cut off in order for acceptance. whether it be his peculiarities, his possible queerness, or even an old friend. Quote Asia Romano for Vox.
In any other film, the driving tension would be the obvious question of whether Marcello will be morally bankrupt enough to kill the professor, simply to adhere to his vision of normalcy. But although Bertolucci turns this uncertainty into a taut central question, it's not the central question. After all, even though Marcello waffles again and again when asked to commit to an ideology, an emotion, or even to an identity, he is always blunt about his intentions to join the fascists and be normal, whatever it takes. It's this aspect of the film that gives The Conformist a startling, even disturbing amount of political heft today. Marcello is, for all intents, no different than the modern, ironically detached internet troll who starts out parroting alt-right memes for the lulz, but inevitably finds himself sincerely disseminating white supremacist rhetoric.
And in that desire to enforce that same conformity on all of us, the target on the back of the outgroup grows, and we see the lines get drawn. How those who start out simply wanting to blend in may end up committing acts of cruelty on the innocent who doesn't conform like them. The others. In that worldview, to be normal is not just to fit in, but to permanently dispose of those who don't. Draw the line between them and you. In the film, it can be seen in the hunting down of dissidents and control of information, but we see it in other forms around the world, like the infamous Nazi pamphlets of the time that compared Jewish people to rats. In order to perfect their ideal society, their entire ideology must be built around destroying an other, something that defines them as average, the ideal, and we see this every day still.
America was, until this past generation, a white country.
Transgenderism must be eradicated.
This policy is called the Great Replacement.
Jews will not replace us!
Because that is natural and normal for us.
Well, there is a Muslim problem.
We need to have something like a white uprising.
Hail our people! Hail victory!
Fascism is an ideology of destruction, one that must have others to destroy, to eliminate from existence in order to show its strength and to prove its superiority and normality. But in the end, that is the fatal flaw of fascist thought. Their perfection is so cruel that it's unobtainable. You can shave off all your edges, conform as best as you can, and there will always have to be an other for this ideology to thrive. It may start with enemies of the movement and prey on typical bigotries, but its endgame is no utopia like they promise. It's just a pile of corpses and two remaining humans arguing over who is the blondest and most blue-eyed. It's a doomsday cult where the Ubermensch is forever shifting depending on what needs to be done. And if it were to succeed, it'd bring that apocalypse to us.
Fascism is a death wish projected outwards. Primal rage twisted in on itself, seeking to destroy the self, then transferred outwards. It is the logic of abuse, the weak destroying the weak to bond with the strong, to please the idealized malignant father who can only desire what hates, right down to the end of the world. But proving that one can hate also costs one the very self which can be loved. And that leaves behind only the death wish. And in that way, fascism is a tragedy too. If your whole life revolves around hating to try to earn love, you will never be loved at all, only used, because there is nothing in you left to see, know, or hold, even if you do end the world.
And that's what The Conformist shows. A man who loses everything just because he wants to gain normality and acceptance from a society built for a narrow few, all by targeting others instead of expanding said society. And after all that, it leaves Marcello alone and lost. Watching as all he worked for leaves him with ashes and dust. Midway through the film, there is a scene where Marcello reenacts a speech Professor Quattri gave to him in university about Plato's cave allegory. In the shot, Quattri is always shadowed while Marcello peers around at the cast shadows. He is watching the shadows that tell him he must be the average, and the other must be punished, only for Quattri to open a window and dispel the shadows. But Marcello doesn't learn from this. He still helps hunt down Quattri as a dissident, and he still ends up alone, with the ending being him facing a fire. Maybe the same fire used by the fascists he followed to pacify him into obedience. Just a puppet on a string. A prisoner in a cave. And that is what is promised by the fascist worldview. No matter what, you will be left alone, reflecting on everything you denied yourself as you destroyed that other. They'll put you up against that wall too, as you realize it was all for nothing. And as anti-fascists, that's what we need to take away from this. The fascist ideal may be attractive to those seeking purpose, seeking acceptance, and just the bigoted wishing to give themselves meaning through being the norm or superior race or whatever. But it'll never truly provide them with that happiness. It'll only destroy them and others. It is a corrosive force, a poison to the system, a cancer cell that grows and grows. And it is not worth entertaining for 1 second. At the end of the day, the path of least resistance that fascism presents itself as, i.e. forming into the shape of traditions and denying yourself everything for social acceptance, may be appealing, but it's hollow. It's nothing. It'll poison everything you touch, as that poison itself slowly kills you from the inside and out, leaving you to realize that the only good fascist is a dead one. Kill the conformist inside your head.
Mussolini is dead in a howling mob in Milan, where fascism was born. Mussolini and his mistress hang from the rafters of a gas station. There are none to mourn. The sawdust has run out of Caesar.
is waking outside my window. Bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Directs my senses into the sunlight, for there are things that I must do. Wish me luck now, I have to leave you. Bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. With my friends now, up to the city. We're gonna shake the gates of hell, and I will tell them, we will tell them, bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, 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 that our sunlight is not for franchise, and wish the bastards drop down dead. Next time you see me, I may be smiling. Bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao.
I'd like to give a special thanks to my $10 a month patrons: Arif Hassan, Maxibon, Karen Kanaki, T&B, Morgan T, Ben Birdperson, Daniel, and Justin Shepard.